our interlobar artery. Here we have our arcuate artery. This is a kidney lobe, right, which is the medullary pyramid and the cortex that's associated with it. So we have our arcuate artery. We have our interlobular arteries going up into the cortex. And what do we call these branches coming off of the interlobular arteries going into these circular structures?
Afferent.
Yeah, afferent, starting with an A, afferent arterioles. And what do we call the little blood vessels coming out of the circular structures?
Efferent.
Yeah, efferent with an E, efferent arterioles. And efferent arterioles branch into this little capillary bed, and what do we call that capillary bed? Peritubular capillaries. So once the blood goes through those peritubular capillaries, we have some things that will happen we'll talk about later. The blood vessels reconverge, and then they start back out of the kidney. And what is this blood vessel right here going out of the kidney?
Interlobe?
Same as this up here.
The renal venule.
Interlobular vein. And that converges with this, which is the arcuate vein. And then we have one that's paralleling this, and that is the interlobar vein. And then we don't have a lobar or a segmental vein. We just have the vessels going out of the kidney, and that is the renal vein. Okay, so that's our blood flow through the kidney. Over here, looking at this structure, what do we call these little capillaries right here? Glomerular capillaries, or the glomerulus is fine too. And what is this vessel leading into the glomerulus called? Afferent arteriole. And what is this one coming out of the glomerulus? Afferent arteriole. How do I know this is the afferent one and that's the efferent one?
Bigger diameter.
Bigger size. Afferent arteriole is usually larger in diameter than the afferent arteriole, and that's so more blood can go into the glomerulus than what gets drained out, and that creates the high pressure bed that pushes the plasma out into this surrounding cup here. What do we call this cup-like structure?
Bowman's
Capsule.
Bowman's capsule. What do we call the glomerulus plus the Bowman's capsule? Renal corpuscle. What's the main process that occurs in the renal corpuscle? Filtration of what? Blood plasma. If on the exam, if I ask you what's the main thing that happens there and you just put filtration, I'll give you half a point and I'll say, of what? Right? So you have to tell me what's being filtered. Blood plasma that's being filtered out, right? And then that plasma gets, what is lacking in the filtrate that is still found in the blood plasma in the proteins and blood cells. So we shouldn't have any proteins or blood cells because they're too large to pass through the pores in the filtration membrane. What do we call these cells that are covering the glomerulus? Photocyte cells, right? And after the filtrate gets filtered out into the Bowman's capsule, it starts its journey through the renal tubule. What is this first part of the renal tubule? Proximal convoluted tubule, same as this here. So this is just kind of an enlarged version of that. What's the main thing that happens in the proximal convoluted tubule?
Tubular reabsorption.
Tubular reabsorption from the proximal convoluted tubule. And what is it being reabsorbed into? The peritubular capillaries. So it's going from the proximal convoluted tubule into the peritubular capillaries. About how much of the filtrate that got filtered out in the Bowman's capsule gets reabsorbed into the peritubular capillaries?
65?
Yeah, about 65%, could even be up to 75%. So most of what gets filtered out gets reabsorbed. What kind of things get reabsorbed?
Water.
Glucose, amino acids.
Vitamins, water, a lot of water.
Amino acids.
Amino acids, things that the body needs, right? Get reabsorbed. What kind of things don't get reabsorbed usually?
Red blood
And
cells.
nitrogenous waste like creatine, uric acid, urea, ammonia, stuff like that, right? Those don't get reabsorbed. Okay, then what's left of the filtrate starts going down into the medulla region. And what do we call this little hairpin structure that's going down into the medulla?
Loop of Henle.
The loop of Henle, or the nephron loop. And what do we call this portion of the loop of Henle going down into the medulla? Descending limb. It's sometimes called the thin limb because it's thinner than the other side. And it has more squamous types of cells in its walls. What happens in the descending limb? What's the main?
Water reabsorption.
Water reabsorption. Goes down to the bottom, it comes back up again. It's in the what? What do you call this part?
Ascending.
Ascending limb, which is also called the thick segment. And what happens in the ascending limb? Yeah, salt reabsorption. So sodium, potassium, chloride, those types of things. What is it that causes the water to come out of the descending limb? It's the salts that are being put out of the ascending limb, right? That causes an osmotic gradient. So basically water's being sucked out of the descending limb because these cells are permeable to water, but the cells of the ascending limb are not permeable to water. They are permeable to salt because they have transport proteins for salts in them, right? So once we come back up to the cortex region again, we get up here, and now it starts twisting and turning again. And what do we call this part that's twisting and turning up in the cortex? Distal convoluted tubule. What's the main thing that's happening in the distal convoluted tubule?
Secretion, tubular secretion.
Well, there's a little bit of reabsorption, not a lot of reabsorption, because remember there's not very many microvilli in the cells, the apical surface. So we're having some secretion. And what is secretion? Yes. What blood vessels?
From the
Peritubular capillaries into the distal convoluted tubule, right? And what kind of things get secreted?
urine.
Think of it this way. The kidney is trying to fine-tune the blood. This is its last chance to fine-tune the blood. So if there are too many hydrogen ions being generated, like acidosis is starting to occur, it's going to be secreting hydrogen ions from the blood into the renal tubule. If alkalosis is starting to occur, then it's going to be secreting what? Bicarbonate ions into the renal tubule. And then any other nitrogenous waste products that didn't get filtered out initially, like urea, uric acid, creatine, ammonia, and also drugs like aspirin, penicillin, things like that. That's why you have to take an aspirin every 3 or 4 hours if you're taking aspirin for pain, is because it's being eliminated by the kidneys. Every time you urinate, that aspirin's going out in the urine, right? So that's going out in the distal convoluted tubule. And then once that filtrate gets to here, what is this part of the tubule called?
Collecting duct.
Collecting duct. Can anything happen in the collecting duct other than just feeding the urine out?
A little
Yes.
bit of
What can happen?
Reabsorption.
We can have some secretion. We can also have reabsorption of what in particular?
Water.
Water. What is the reabsorption of water under the control of in the collecting duct?
ADH.
ADH, antidiuretic hormone. So if we have antidiuretic hormone present, we can get the installation of those aquaporin water transport proteins, and we can reabsorb some water. So that would be if we're starting to become dehydrated. We would basically get ADH that would be secreted. The collecting duct goes down to the bottom of the renal pyramid, and what does it become? And actually, I'll show you this in this other model. Yeah, so here we have a couple